All right, everybody. Now we're going to learn about block elements and inline elements. Block and inline elements. Now, these are not HTML elements. There's no block tag or inline tag. There's nothing like this. That's not what I'm talking about. When I describe block or inline elements, I'm really talking about the elements that we've already used and already seen. And these elements naturally have a display property which is by default set to block, inline, or inline block. Okay? So this is really a characteristic of different elements in your HTML. And all elements in your HTML, which you will deal with, are naturally either block, inline, or inline block. Okay? Don't worry about inline block, though. It's very similar to inline. I will explain the difference. So we're going to focus on block versus inline. What does it mean for an element to be block, and what does it mean for an element to be inline? Well, to demonstrate, I'm going to write a couple H1s here on my page. They're all going to say hello. And when I reload my page, this is what we see. Hopefully this doesn't surprise you. Hopefully this is what you expected to see. Now if I asked you how much space are my H1s actually taking up, what would you tell me? Or in other words, if I asked you how wide are each of these H1s, what would you tell me? Would you tell me that they're this wide? As wide as the text that's inside them requires? If that's your answer, that's fine. I get it. I totally understand. But what I want you to do is right-click on your page, open your inspector, and either by hovering over the element, hovering over one of the H1s in your Elements tab down here, or clicking on this button and highlighting one of them with your mouse, I want you to notice how much space each H1 is actually taking up. It's reaching all the way across our page, right? It's got a lot of empty space to the right of our hello, but it is taking up the entire row on which it is sitting. And if you think about it, HTML reads top to bottom and left to right. That's how it reads, and that's how elements render. So if our H1s really had only taken up the space required by the word hello, we would expect to see hello, 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 hello. We'd expect to see them lining up on the same line. But we're not. They're actually stacking vertically, top to bottom. They are each taking up 100% of the width available to them. 100% of the horizontal space available to them. And as a result, they are not allowing any other element to sit on the same line. These are block elements. Okay? Block elements, they take up all the horizontal space available to them. They refuse to allow other elements to sit on the same line with them, to sit next to them. And as you create more block elements, they always start on a new line. Okay? Inline elements are things like buttons. I'm going to create a couple buttons now. And just to keep things nice and clean and separate, I'm going to put all of our buttons inside of a div. So they're very separate from our H1s. And there we go. our three buttons are lining up next to each other horizontally. They're all sitting on the same line. They're all sitting on the same line. Okay? That's because buttons are naturally inline elements. To be honest, buttons are what we call inline block. But right now, I don't want you to worry about that distinction. I want to focus right now on the difference between block and inline. Okay, inline block is just another type of inline. So, block elements and inline elements. We can see how they naturally behave very differently. The buttons line up next to each other. The H1s do not. Okay, so I'm going to create some new elements here. Load my page. And I want you to pause and take a moment and tell me if these paragraph elements, these P's, are block or inline. Okay, I hope you took some time to think about it, or I hope you opened up your inspector and maybe tried to take a closer look, added this code yourself, and we can see right here in our Styles tab, display block under the P. Obviously, these are block elements. They stack vertically, and you can see that they're taking up 100% of the horizontal space available to them. Okay, so inline elements only take up the space required by their content, like this click me. They do allow other elements to sit next to them in a line horizontally, but they have a couple of quirks. Okay, I'm going to get rid of all but one of my H1s. I'm going to get rid of all but one of my buttons, and I'm going to get rid of all of my paragraphs. Actually, I'm going to bring back another H1, two H1s, okay? So two block elements and one inline block element. Let me bring back another button as well. So we got 2 and 2. I'm going to jump into CSS. I'm going to select all the H1s on my page, and I'm going to change them from block elements to inline elements, just like that. Now watch what happens to the H1s when I reload my page. Now they're lining up horizontally. They're sitting next to each other. They're only taking up the space required by their content. Make sense? Now, I'm going to select all the buttons on my page, and I'm going to change them to be block elements. So my H1s will be inline, my buttons will be block. Let's see what happens. Now the buttons are stacking vertically. They're not allowing other elements to sit next to them on the same line. Okay, so while elements have a default display property of block inline or inline block, we can change that display property to suit our needs. So what's an example of where we would actually change the display property to suit our needs? I'll show you. I'm going to create an unordered list, and inside this unordered list, I want you to do this with me, okay? If you've been watching the videos up to this point and have not, for some reason, been coding along with the videos, please do this with me now, okay? Make sure you have your template all set up. Make sure you copy your template, rename it, open that renamed copy in Sublime, and code along with me here. I've created an unordered list in my HTML. And inside my unordered list, I'm going to create an LI, a list item, and I'm just going to put link inside that list item. And copy it so that we have 3 of these list items in total. And there are our list items inside our unordered list. But I want these list items to line up horizontally. So I'm going to select my list items and change them. Well, let's figure out first, what is their natural display property based on what we see here. Hopefully, you're able to identify them as block elements. Now, what about their parent unordered list? What's the natural display property of the unordered list? Well, obviously, it too is a block element. Okay? So, if I want to change the display property of the list items, and they're naturally, currently, block elements, let's change it to inline. Select all my list items, give them the display property with a value of inline. And now they line up horizontally. Okay? If you're not sure still why I would do this, I'm going to go ahead and format these guys a little bit more to hopefully give you a hint. Let's do one more. Two more. All right, how about that? Three more. There we go. All right, so what does that look like to you? Hopefully, it should look like a navigation bar. A navigation bar or menu bar, something that's located on the top of virtually every website out there today, which allows us to navigate through a website's different sections or link to an additional internal page, like the About page or the Contact page. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, we've gotten this far. We've made a navigation bar out of an unordered list and 3 list items and a bit of CSS. Let's take it a little further. I want to space these list items out. So I'm going to try to give them a margin of 10 pixels. Nice. Works. However, margin is not always going to be the appropriate choice for a situation like this. I'm not going to really get into why margin won't be the appropriate choice because we haven't spent much time talking about CSS yet. But suffice to say that margin works here, but it will not work everywhere. And there are some limitations to what we can do to inline elements. We can't always style inline elements in the same way that we can block elements. And so as a result, we actually rarely use display inline as a manual change the display property of an element. Instead, we most often use display inline block. Now this is not going to change very much. Did you notice what did change? Here, I'll go back. Inline block. I hope you saw the change. We haven't talked yet about the box model or how margin actually works. But suffice to say that this margin property, which I gave to my LIs, is only working about 50% on the inline version of these elements. Okay, again, this is not something you need to worry about just now. But I want you to understand that there are limitations to how we can style inline elements. As a result, we use inline block more often than not when we want to force elements to line up next to each other. Inline block is what allows us to do that. Inline block. Okay? And an inline block element is exactly the same as an inline element, except it is able to receive any kind of block level stylings. So really all that means is it behaves exactly like an inline element, but there are no limitations to the styles that we can apply to it. So for all intents and purposes, inline block is the superior choice if you're trying to get precise control over your layout. That's what I want you to walk away with from this. If you want to line elements up next to each other, inline block is the go-to. Okay, now there's one last thing which I want to talk to you about regarding inline block. I'm going to get rid of a lot of this code. Just going to keep the nav bar. Okay, and below my unordered list, I'm going to create two divs. Two empty divs. Now in CSS, I'm going to select my divs. I'm going to give them a background color so that we can see them. How about purple? I'm going to give them a height. Actually, no. Let's stick with just the background color. Reload my page. Where are my divs? I don't see them. Well, if you don't see an element that you think should be there, look for it in your Elements tab. Here's my unordered list. There are my divs. They're there. I think I should see them. The browser obviously sees them. But if you look at the little tag that pops up right there when I hover over the divs, it tells me that they have a height of 0. They have no height and no content, so there is nothing to see. They're not missing, they're just invisible right now because there's nothing inside them. Okay, I want you to remember that about divs. It gives a lot of students a lot of trouble at first when they're not sure where their divs have gone. Okay, so in addition to background color, I'm also going to give them a little height. Height of 100 pixels. Okay, I'm also going to give them a small margin to the bottom so we can see where they separate. There are my two divs. Now can you tell me what type of element is a div? Is it inline or block? Obviously they're block, right? They take up all the horizontal space available to them and they stack one on top of the other. They start on a new line. If I wanted to get these divs to line up next to each other, I would need to change their display property to something like inline block. Well, now they're just entirely gone. Now they have no width because what do inline elements do? They take up only as much space as their content requires. Well, once again, these divs have no content. So let's force them to have a width of, say, also 100 pixels. Well, now we have two perfect squares lined up next to each other. That works. And now let's say I want them to each take up exactly 1/2 of my screen. So I'm going to give them a width of 50%. Uh-oh, that doesn't seem to work. Well, let's see, does 49% work? It does, for some reason, but 50% does not. The reason for this little quirk, is that the space between inline elements in your HTML actually takes up space. So if I write both of these divs on the same line like that, watch what happens to this white line between them. It's gone. Now let's try a width of 50%. It works. It works. Here, I'm going to give one of them a different color. Okay, now they fit. However, this is really ugly HTML. So my decision, my personal workaround for this is to turn the space between these divs into a comment. Just like that. See the start of a comment, end of a comment. Now, reading my HTML, it still reads normally, it still looks good, everything is indented the way it should be, but that space has been commented out. And you'll see it still works. All right, this is a technique, and this display property is something you will need to understand very much for this week's in-class exercises, or this week's exercises, pardon me, and for next week's homework especially. Next week's project involves quite a bit of inline block and using this to manipulate your layouts. And when you need to get multiple inline elements to take up all of the width on a given row, 50% and 50%, you have to remember that those line breaks in your HTML will take up some space. They may force an element onto the next line, so you need to be careful of that. All right, I hope this has been a helpful demonstration of the difference between block and inline elements. What I want you guys to do now is, hopefully you've been coding along with me, I want you to practice turning these list items into working clickable links. They need to go somewhere. I don't care where they go. They could all go to Wikipedia, or they could go to Google, or they could go to a GIF. I don't care. But they need to be working, they need to be clickable, and they need to go somewhere. Okay? So, use what we talked about in the previous video about adding links to your page and turn these list items into functional navbar links. And in future, as you encounter new elements or as you use elements, I want you to ask yourself, is this element block? Is it inline? Or is it inline block? If for whatever reason you cannot tell, don't forget that you can select it and look in the Styles tab of your inspector. Display block. So unordered lists are block elements.